everyone, this is Amy Peterson, and I'm excited to welcome you to this webinar today, Strategies for Setting Data-Driven Behavioral Individualized Education Program Goals. So we'll jump right in, and we'll really start off with just briefly introducing you to the GoToWebinar platform. So Eliza, if you want to flip over. Yeah, so on your panels, you should see a question pod, and this is where you can ask any questions you might have. If you're having technical issues about sound or any kind of issues with that, feel free to ask those there. And if you have questions for the presenters, you can also ask those questions there. If they're quick questions that we can give you a quick answer to, we'll do that right in the moment. But we might also hold some of those questions till the end and ask the presenters after they're done sharing in the event that they answer any of those questions at that time. So that's just a quick hint for you there. You'll also see a handout pod on that same toolbar where you can access the slides for this webinar as well as the goals, the guide that we just recently released related to the content of this webinar. So those are both available for you. And then in the chat pod, there was also the link to where all of the recording for this webinar will be on the website for you as well. This webinar is a collaborative effort between the National Center on Intensive Intervention as well as the new Progress Center. And so this is a center that just was funded by the Office of Special Education Programs that really is focused on helping local schools and educators to implement high quality education programs. So there'll be a lot more information coming out from this center, but if you want to connect with the center and learn a little bit more, you can see the website down at the bottom there, promotingprogress.org. So please visit that website, stay connected, let us know your challenges and the work that you're doing. There's a place to sign up on that website for the email list so you can continue to learn more as the work comes out and the technical assistant opportunities come out from that center as well. This webinar is really going to focus in on a couple things. So we're going to really talk about understanding how progress monitoring can support the delivery of intensive intervention and also really looking at goal setting. So looking at how we can set behavioral goals to really improve our IEPs and really look at those behavioral IEP goals. So we'll talk about that across the webinar. And I just want to introduce, before I turn it over to the presenters, the two presenters for this webinar. So we've got Dr. Teri Marx, who's here at the American Institutes for Research and the National Center on Intensive Intervention, as well as actually the Progress Center that I just mentioned. And she is a senior researcher here at AIR. She leads a lot of technical assistance and professional development work across states and districts and schools throughout the country around intensive intervention in academics and behavior. She supports states in the implementation of MTSS frameworks and a range of different projects and work there. And she comes to us from a former hat as a social worker, a school social worker, and so brings that perspective as well to this work, and she'll talk about that a little bit during the session, I believe. And our other presenter is Dr. Faith Miller, who's an associate professor of educational psychology within the School of Psychology program at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And her research interests really focus on improving multi-tiered systems of support for students who experience social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. And that includes both the use of defensible assessments as well as database decision-making and problem-solving to really provide that continuum of high-quality interventions and supports for students. So we're excited to have both Faith and Teri on to share their expertise with us around this behavior goal setting. And if you saw that behavior guide earlier, you'll see that there are the two authors for that guide as well, and they'll talk through kind of that content a little bit more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teri Marx to start us off.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. This is Teri Marx, and Amy did introduce me. I am here at the American Institutes for Research and do work on NCII as well as the Progress Center. And as Amy mentioned, I was a school social worker. I worked in the state of Illinois. And so some of the examples that I give are actually from my personal experience to try to make that connection to when I was in practice and some of the things that I wish I would have known. We're going to just start out by framing our conversation. So the slide that's up on the screen is really talking about there's no time like the present. And we really believe this to be true. Because I'm not sure if everybody's heard, but there was a recent Supreme Court ruling, the Andrew F. case in 2017. There are some potential implications for us to consider As a result of that case, and if you're not familiar with that case, I encourage you to check out the Office of Special Education Programs at the U.S. Department of Education's frequently asked questions around the case for some of the ways that they've talked about this. But really, that case was a case that landed all the way at the Supreme Court level. And what it's really helping us to think about as educators is making sure that in our IEPs, whether we are talking about academics, functional performance, behavioral, social, emotional, whatever skill that we are focused on, we need to make sure that we are demonstrating students' progress toward the goal that we've written into the IEP. And that is definitely a foundation for helping us to ascertain if the free and appropriate public education standard was met. What the Andrew F. case as well is helping us to think about is really making sure that we are ensuring our students with disabilities in particular can meet challenging standards. There are things that we can't necessarily say about the case from a national center perspective, just because we aren't lawyers, right? So we can't go into the nitty-gritty of the legal details and some of the legal implications. So we do encourage you to check with your state and or local district folks, representatives that are supporting you in this work to see if there's been any clarifications in your local policies in relationship to the Andrew F. case. Let's go ahead and move forward, and I'm going to introduce you, if you haven't already been exposed to the data-based individualization process, and we're going to go ahead and kind of walk through that process now. What it is it's really a way to deliver intensive intervention. And here at the National Center on Intensive Intervention, the way that we talk about that is that we are addressing severe and or persistent learning and or behavioral difficulties. We talk about intensive intervention in two ways. One, it has to be driven by data, and we characterize intensity through increasing that intensity and or the individualization of the supports that we're providing to students. So DBI, which we're going to now talk about, is this process that we're going to be using. So Eliza, you can flip to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the process, the graphic off to the left really kind of walks through what that process is. And it is just that. It's a process for delivering intensive intervention. So it's not going to be, here's the answer to fix all of your problems at Tier 3. Here's your answer to fix all of your problems in special education. This is really intended just to be a process for helping you to systematize your iterative process around use of data to inform instructional interventions that we're providing. So we start that process by delivering a Tier 2 and or evidence-based practice or program with fidelity. We're going to then progress monitor for student responsiveness. If the student is non-responsive to what we're already providing and putting in place for that student, we're going to dig deeper by gathering some diagnostic data and reviewing those diagnostic data. In the area of behavior, this might look similar to what we might call some informal functional behavioral assessment processes. Then from there, we're going to craft our support plan. We're going to make sure that we're looking for ways to intensify or adapt that existing intervention. So we're not necessarily using those data and the student non-responsiveness to the individual intervention to say, hey, we're going to scrap that completely, but we're going to use the data that we have to maybe make some informed decisions about ensuring that we are addressing the student's function of behavior appropriately during that intervention, making sure that they're having ample opportunities to practice skills and get opportunities for feedback and corrective feedback and positive feedback. As we're doing those intensifications and adaptations, we need to continue delivering that collecting that progress monitoring data and to use that. So the next slide really just recaps the 5 steps that I shared. We start with that intervention, we progress monitor, we engage in some level of a diagnostic assessment, we're going to make an adaptation to our validated intervention that we've been delivering with fidelity, and we're going to continue that progress monitoring as we encounter any times when the student's instruction might need to change as a result of their responsiveness. So we bring this up, and we're going to talk now about how this process that we just referred to, that data-based individualization or DBI process, can really help us within our special education requirements. So we know that many schools across the nation are implementing multi-tiered system of supports, and we are we are at the center level working with some states intensively and through targeted relationships to help them think about how they can use that DBI process to help with their tier 3, their intensive intervention processes, as well as to support with some of their special education decisions. So on the first part of that, we would see the referral and eligibility requirements. So what we often are charged to do within referral processes for special education or to determine eligibility is to really make sure that we have determined that what we're doing, the student is still needs either that same level of support to ensure that they can continue to make progress. We might have to rule out lack of instruction on the academic side, depending on what category we are actually referring or making eligibility determinations for. And it is also another method for us to give progress monitoring data to our parents and families that we're working with. And then on the next part here, it's also information that can help us as we're developing an IEP, so that individualized education program, and as we're implementing our specially designed instruction as a part of our IEP. So progress monitoring data is really great information to include in our PLAS statement, our present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. It also helps us set goals and design our specially designed instruction. And in some cases, it may also help us estimate the level of service needed. I am getting a little bit of feedback, so I think we might have one of our speakers not on mute, so if you could just mute while we're going through. All right, so the data-based individualization process, you heard the word individualizing, or individualization, but we have to think about what we're doing first before we actually individualize our intervention. So that first step, as we talked about, is really starting with delivering that evidence-based practice or program with fidelity. We're then going to develop a progress monitoring plan to support determining whether or not the student is making progress, and that has to be progress in relationship to a goal set for the student. So that's that second step. You can't progress monitor if you don't have a goal. And so that's really what we want to kind of help to clarify in this webinar, is how we can use some of these practices that we're going to talk about to help us inform a progress monitoring plan and goal setting. So let's think about that goal setting. We want to base them on logical practices, and we want to make sure that every single member of our IEP team, if we have a problem-solving team, whatever it might be, they need to understand how that goal was set, why the goal was set in the way that it was, and then what is the level of intensity of intervention that we need to deliver in order for the student to meet that goal. And that's where we really kind of want to make sure we're all on the same page around that. In addition, that orange box at the bottom is really telling us knowing the goal helps educators select appropriate interventions to help students reach the goal. That is true across academics and behavior. But we're going to focus on the behavioral side of things today, and that's probably why you signed up for this webinar in the first place. And so we're going to talk now about behavioral progress monitoring and goal setting. The resource that we're going to be highlighting is a new guide that we put out, and it's also included in the handout section of the toolbar that you have. And it's a resource, and the guide covers all of these different, all of the different things that are bulleted on this page. So you can access information about what do we really need to make sure we're including in our behavioral IEP goals, how do we know which behaviors we should be addressing, and how do we actually monitor progress toward those goals that we're setting for students. And that's what we're going to be framing this conversation around today. So flipping to the next slide.
Hi, Teri. This is Amy. Before you go on, I just want to jump in, and we had a question. If you could define what you mean by PLAS.
Present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. Thanks. Yep. All right, so there's a quote on this slide here. You'll see that it is a quote from me. So I was a school social worker, and I will tell you that as I was practicing, I did collect a ton of data, right? I was going into classrooms all the time, observing students, interviewing parents and teachers, perhaps giving some rating scales to teachers. And then oftentimes what I would do is I would write a really quality FBA and behavior support plan. I'm not trying to toot my own horn on that one, but I do think that they were pretty good quality plans. But after that, I stopped collecting data. And I'm wondering if that's the same for anybody else. And I think one of the reasons that that was true for me when I was in practice is because I felt as though the data collection was more important for the legal requirement of the FBA and the BIP, as opposed to really truly understanding the purpose of data collection, which is to inform whether or not the student is being responsive to what we're doing, right? And helping us to make informed decisions about student progress. And so the takeaway here is that we have to continue collecting data and we have to be progress monitoring. So how do we fix that fatal flaw? Through progress monitoring. And you'll see here, we are clicking through and we are seeing multiple behavior point sheets. How many of you are familiar with those point sheets, right? What I will tell you is I collected a lot of those and I still see educators collecting a lot of point sheets, whether it's a check-in, check-out point card, a daily report card that you're sending home to parents, just information, just generally speaking. It could be, you know, as a student goes through various periods of the day, they're either self-monitoring or the teachers are reporting on their performance. And we see stacks and stacks of paper. So that's what that left side is representing, stacks and stacks of paper. What we don't often do is then use those stacks and stacks of paper in a meaningful way to determine whether or not the student is making progress. And that's what's represented on the right-hand side of this slide. So what we want to move from is stacks and stacks of paper that might have really good information about the student's behavior and helping us to identify perhaps patterns of when student behavior is likely to occur. It could provide anecdotal information from teachers that's going to help us understand maybe the frequency and or topography of the behavior. But what we really want to make sure that we're doing is if we are collecting those data, the first thing that we want to start doing is making sure that we're graphing that, because when we are able to visually see in comparison to where we expect the student to be, so that's that horizontal line on our graph over there, the goal line, right? We can then look and see whether or not that student is making progress and whether or not they're responding to what we've put into place. So what does IDEA say about IEP goals? They have to be related to function, or not have to be. They can address functional skills that students need. So they should be written to meet the child's needs and help the child be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. And so those are the key parts that I'm pulling out of this section of the IDEA. And we really do want to then clarify on the next slide what we're going to put into these quality behavioral IEP goals that's going to help us to get to the standards that are there through the IDEA. What I will say about this, and you'll see that there's a little asterisk up there, is that we need to check with our state or district regulations, policy, and guidance around this first. Some states are actually a little bit more specific or less specific than others, and they may have additional policy or guidance that you need to follow. But generally speaking, what we want to be seeing in our IEP goals is we have to have the time frame, the assessment condition, whatever that target behavior is that we are focused on, the supports needed, and the level of proficiency or timeline, and then how we're going to measure it. And so this is actually a table that is pulled directly out of the guide that's included as a handout, so you don't have to feel like you have to rush down and take a picture of the slide or jot down all of the information. You can access this same chart just by going to that guide that's already developed. And what you'll see in it is that there are examples, but then there also includes some sample goal language. And what we're saying is that the 3 dots on each, so if you look at like assessment condition, there's 3 kind of categories, and then the rest of them have 3. The top line goes to the top line in each of the rows, if that makes sense. The goal should, and this is going to be information that we need to be thinking about, we should, in all of our goals, be addressing those present levels. So again, going back to present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, we should have already had some level of data to inform our present level statements, right? So we might have already collected some data as a part of either an eligibility and or annual review kind of process that we're engaging in. And so we might have those data readily available. The other thing that we are encouraging folks to do is to focus your IEP goals on the replacement behavior. And that's going to help us measure what the student will be doing, not necessarily on the behavior change. And it's also going to help us to be able then to connect what we're doing as far as intervention to determining the student's responsiveness to that intervention. And so focusing on the replacement behavior is something that we are going to encourage. I'm not going to walk through the examples and non-examples right now on this webinar just for time's sake, but they are included and described in more depth in the guide. So let's go on. So other tips about the goal. We should focus on student behavior, not educator behavior, right? We really, again, if we're focusing on a replacement behavior, it's something that we need to see the student demonstrate. We also need to monitor that goal with enough frequency to determine progress and make timely instructional and/or intervention decisions. What those behavior charts that we kind of talked about, if there's stacks and stacks of paper sitting on your desk, is that we might be doing daily monitoring or even hourly monitoring of students' behavior, but they're not easily interpreted for responsiveness. We also should be using a measure that is objective, valid, and reliable. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the first one that's listed there, direct behavior rating, rather than a more subjective measure. And we should also make sure that the goal is realistic yet ambitious. And that is important too, because we want to make sure that we are not, asking our students who we know have some level of struggle or level of challenge in relationship to a potential disability or other executive functioning or communication needs, to expect that their performance is going to be perhaps greater than their peers is not something that we want to make sure that we're that we want to include in the IEP. We want to make sure that we're realistic in the student's performance given our present levels, the data that we have, all of the information that we know about that student, but still ambitious enough so that we can help them kind of make sure that they're closing gaps both in academic performance as well as functional and behavioral performance. So, replacement behavior. We get asked this question, and actually a question kind of came in before the webinar. You had an opportunity to submit questions, and there was a question around this. If we're focusing our goal on the replacement behavior, what about the problem behaviors? And we're calling them kind of, those are the target behaviors or behaviors of concern. One of the things that we talk about in the guide is that we want to make sure that we're not just talking about externalizing behaviors when we're thinking about this, but we're thinking about internalizing behaviors. If a student is withdrawn or perhaps disengaged in instruction, that's another level of behavior that we don't often try to target. And so what we want to focus on here is the replacement behavior, but we can still collect information on the student's problem behavior, and I'm putting in air quotes, and I know you can't see me, that word problem, or that target behavior. And in some instances, you could be monitoring multiple target behaviors or problem behaviors while you're also identifying the student's responsiveness to your intervention or instruction that you've put in place on that replacement behavior. This also is going to provide you with a level of evidence that you can share with parents and families to really help them understand exactly whether or not the student is making progress. And so how do we know which behavior to identify, prioritize, and operationalize? And that's the next slide, Eliza. From here, what I'm going to do is flip it over to Faith Miller, and she is going to take it from here and help you figure this part out. How do we actually make sure that we are able to understand what the behavior of concern is and then move forward with collecting really informative progress monitoring data to help us inform a goal? So Faith, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Teri, and thanks everyone. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to talk with you all today about this really important topic. So I think Teri did a really nice job providing sort of an overview and some context for this, right? But certainly I think what all of us are really eager for is, okay, but what does this look like? How do we actually do this? So I'm going to spend some time now talking a little bit about the process, right, sort of herein. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how do we actually identify, prioritize, and operationalize this target behavior, right? And so what we need to do first, right, in this identification process, we have to select a behavior or set of behaviors to focus on, right? This requires the collection of some kind of background information on the context and the features of the behavior. So the context of the behavior tells us about the conditions under which the behavior occurs, right? So about the setting events that are happening before or after the behavior. And this helps us to understand why the behavior is actually occurring. And then we need to know a little bit about the features of the behavior, right? So how long does it last? How frequently does it occur? What does it look like? How intense is it? These features really help us create a behavior definition that allows for objective, reliable measurement. And that is the foundation, right, of being able to engage in this whole process well. We really need to be really systematic in thinking about how we identify, prioritize, and define these targets. So going on to the next slide, we will, once we've gotten a sense, right, through some of these data collection methods about sort of the general sense, right, of the behavior at hand, we need to start to think about prioritizing, right? Oftentimes, it's not just a single behavior necessarily that's of concern, but multiple behaviors, right? And so what do we do in those cases where it's, you know, sort of a constellation of behaviors? And so really what we're encouraging folks to do is really think about sort of parsimony here, right? So what will get us the most bang for our buck? So think about really prioritizing only a few behaviors in order to make that data collection and analysis process more feasible. And by really individualizing based on fewer behaviors, we can make decisions more quickly and with more confidence because we've selected behaviors that are most meaningful for a given student. So again, we're just really encouraging folks to really be mindful of that as they're selecting and identifying target behaviors. Once we've done that, right, then we need to operationalize. And I think this one is sort of, I think folks sort of think about, oh yeah, of course we need to operationalize behavior, right? But this is such a critical part of the process, and I think one that's often underemphasized. And so what we need to do is we need to use objective language, right? Really focusing on observable characteristics of the behavior. We need to focus on behavior that can be readily measured, and we need to be very clear about what's included in that behavioral definition and what is not included in that behavioral definition. Remember, sort of the goal here is that anyone, right, reading this definition should be able to come up, look at it, and understand very clearly what the behavior is. We really don't want room for ambiguity here. And so that operationalizing piece is just really, really critical for setting the stage for success here. Once we've done that, right, we also want to highlight this issue of identifying the function. So why is this important? Well, we know based on decades of research that function-based interventions are generally more effective than ones that are not. And so any time we're developing, right, a behavior intervention plan, right, we need to understand the behavior, and we should always be considering function of behavior in that process. And so as we're working through this, we really need to be intentional about thinking through what are some possibilities here in terms of the function of behavior. Sometimes, right, it's due to a skill deficit, right, that the student simply doesn't have the skills to be able to perform that behavior. Other times it's more sort of performance-based, so they're trying to gain something or avoid something. And so really being intentional about identifying that function is really critical, again, because that's sort of one of the core components that's driving the effectiveness of this entire process. So we need to be mindful of that. And again, just sort of a quick caveat here to what Teri had mentioned previously, right? That a lot of times our IEP goals focus almost exclusively on behavior that is problematic to others, right? Those externalizing behaviors, disruptive behavior. But we really need to go beyond that. We need to expand our scope and include behaviors beyond externalizing behaviors and consider internalizing problems, academic engagement, other behaviors that are problematic, that are interfering with the student and the student's performance in the school setting. And so I just want to highlight that as well. So I mentioned function is kind of critical to this whole process, right? So how do we actually identify a functionally relevant replacement behavior? So when we're developing an effective IEP, we have to ensure that the student learns an appropriate replacement behavior, right? Without learning how to do something appropriate in place of this inappropriate behavior, the circumstances likely aren't going to change for the better. So it's important to think about what you want the student to do, to learn, and how that can be supported by the environment that they're in. So just to provide a little bit of an example and some context here. Oh, if we could go back. Back to the previous slide, sorry. There we go. So if a student, right, is having some challenges, lashing out physically, right, whenever they come to a task that they don't understand, right, part of what will help the student is to find an appropriate alternative to this behavior, right, based on their function. So if the student doesn't know how to appropriately ask for help, and then when faced with a demand that he doesn't understand or that produces frustration, right, he gets physical. So if we start to unpack that and focus on the function of the behavior, then when we select an intervention, it's going to lead to the most successful outcome. And so we could spend potentially, right, a lot of time and effort developing interventions and strategies that may not be the best fit, right, if we don't attend to function. So this is something that we just really need to be intentional about during our process. Again, as Teri mentioned, we're really encouraging folks to focus the goal on the replacement behavior. Again, we can continue to progress monitor those target behaviors, but we really want to focus on what we want the student to do. So again, this just sort of breaks down a little bit further, right, some of those details that Teri talked about previously. So we want to identify that condition, right? So for example, when given verbal prompts, what is the replacement behavior that we want the student to engage in? Well, we want the student to ask for help, right, within 1 minute. We want to then define some criterion for acceptable performance, right, and then the timeline for that as well. So that just gives you sort of a snapshot, right, of, again, sort of why it's so important to focus in on that replacement behavior specifically. Of course, right, we can't have a goal that's focused on a replacement behavior without teaching it. So we really need to, be intentional here about teaching that replacement behavior. We need to think beyond the problem behavior itself. There are a lot of core foundational social emotional learning, SEL competencies, right? Self-management, self-awareness, relationship skills, just to name a few. That underlie many of these problems. And so when we think about it, we can adopt a sort of a more whole child approach rather than a sole focus on problem behavior. So again, just sort of moving beyond that sole focus on the problem behavior, really sort of switching that scope and that focus to those replacement behaviors and kind of keeping that whole child approach in mind is really critical to this whole process. So once we've identified, prioritized, and operationalized, right, sort of those targets, it sort of brings us to the heart of our talk today, right? Goal setting and progress monitoring. And so what we're going to do is we're going to outline 4 steps to setting effective behavioral goals and progress monitoring. So those 4 steps are broken down pretty clearly here. We're going to start with step 1, right, determining the measurement. So once we have this behavior identified, we need to think about, okay, well, how are we going to measure it? And you can start to see here, right, that most of these steps are going to be very clear following the identification of those target and replacement behaviors and the conditions of greatest concern. So again, you're sort of setting the groundwork for success, sort of leading up to this point. So we need to think about what tools we're going to use, what approach, right? Are we going to use observation, direct behavior ratings, some other form of measurement tool? How are we actually going to measure that, right? What scale are we going to use? We need to think about frequency of data collection, the context for assessment, and then the decision and evaluation rules, right? And so again, if we're just really intentional about thinking about these things up front, it's going to set us up for success down the line. And I just want to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting one common or two common approaches for progress monitoring. And I think this is where a lot of schools sort of get stuck, right? So how do we actually monitor student progress? What are some defensible ways to do that? Well, typically they sort of fall into two main buckets. One, right, is systematic direct observation. And I think that's really great sort of under the best case scenario, right, where schools have a lot of resources to be able to do that, right? But for some schools, that's not necessarily feasible all the time. And so they need to consider other options. And so direct behavior rating provides one option that basically combines the benefits of systematic direct observation with the efficiency of a rating scale. So I just want to spend just a couple of minutes talking a little bit about DBR for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with that progress monitoring approach. So DBR is a tool that involves a brief rating of a target behavior following a specified observation period. So DBR exists in a lot of different forms. You can sort of think about these as, sort of point sheets, check in, check out data, right? And that can help us, help inform our decision making, certainly. But when we think about sort of a more structured and more standardized approach, DBR sort of can provide that. So it's a flexible assessment method, and that can be sort of tailored to specific target behaviors, but also there's a standardized form that's been developed with evidence of reliability and validity. And so that's one of the strengths of this approach, right, is there's actually, as opposed to sort of a homegrown, as I like to call them, assessment method, the standard DBR form actually has evidence for reliability and validity. And so you could feel a little bit more confident, right, about the defensibility of those data. So that standard form that I mentioned, if we go to the next slide, encompasses three different behavioral targets: academically engaged behavior, respectful behavior, and then non-disruptive behavior. So basically what folks have done sort of in this arena, identify those three key indicators as really critical to student success in school. And so each of those targets, right, if we think about a lot of the focus of our behavioral work in schools, right, sort of relates to, can fall into one of those three buckets. And so, again, just one of the strengths is that that standard form has actually been evaluated for evidence of reliability and validity. So it's just provides a little bit more, you can get a little bit more confidence in terms of the data that you have. So what does that actually look like? For those of you who haven't seen DBR form, we just have provided this for a frame of reference. So each behavior is just a single item, and we ask teachers during the course of regular instruction to observe the student of focus and immediately following the observation period, provide a rating reflecting the proportion of time the student engaged in that target behavior. So you see here, this is the academic engagement scale. We're just asking the teacher to provide an estimate of the proportion of time that the student was academically engaged. So in this example, right, they were academically engaged 60% of the time during large group math instruction for that observation period. So again, you can kind of see how it works to combine the benefits of systematic direct observation and the efficiency of a rating scale. So in my work, I've done a lot related to DBR, and so happy to sort of answer questions folks have about that. But if you're not familiar with DBR, please do visit the NCII website. There's a really nice overview video that we've linked to here that can help get you started, and we've included that link as a resource as well. So that gives you a little bit of context about some options, and obviously, systematic direct observation and DBR aren't the only options, but I'd say there are two of the more defensible options, right, in terms of sort of evidence to support their use. And that's something we just always want to be mindful of when we're selecting a progress monitoring tool. Because if we create something on our own, right, we don't really know if it's measuring what we think it's measuring. We don't know if it's actually sensitive to change. And so when we use these methods that have evidence for reliability and validity, then we can feel, again, a little bit more confident in the decisions that we're making. So once we've identified that measurement approach, those measurement tools, we need to ensure that there are decision and evaluation rules, right? So basically we need to determine, what does responsiveness look like? What does non-responsiveness look like? And again, that time frame becomes really important. We need to be really intentional about this in advance, right, if we want to provide the best support to our students. So again, before we actually engage in this progress monitoring effort, we should really think about, well, what would success look like? When would we think, okay, we need to reevaluate sort of progress here and engage in some problem solving around this? So again, just be really intentional about doing those things in advance. Of course, there's the caveat, right, again, that Teri mentioned, just check with your state regulations related to IEP goal development because there can be differences there. All right, so step 2. Once we've done that, right, we need to think about establishing a baseline of student performance. So unless there's an ethical reason to begin immediate intervention, so if it's a case where the student is posing potential harm to themselves or others, we wouldn't want to sort of postpone intervention in those cases. But in general, right, we're hoping to collect at least 5 data points to establish baseline performance in those cases where, you know, there's not an immediate need to intervene. And so the goal there, right, is to just get a general sense of what that behavior looks like prior to intervention. Ideally, those data would demonstrate stability, right, so they wouldn't be super variable. But sometimes, right, the problem is that the behavior is variable, right? So the student may perform well one day and not perform well another day. So sometimes variability is sort of inherent in the data we collect. And so if we do, you know, see that variable performance, we usually want to try and collect a little bit more information to be able to try and get a more sort of stable estimate of the student's performance. Using DBR as our example, we can think about piloting that DBR tool, right, in advance in order to provide sort of the groundwork for the work that we're doing. So we want the school team to define responsiveness up front, as I mentioned, and because the process is individualized, it's really difficult for us to give sort of hard and fast rules about what constitutes responsiveness. Obviously, this is really going to vary based on the target behavior and the current levels of performance. But we do want to make the goals ambitious, but also feasible to obtain. And I just want to spend a minute talking a little bit more about that, right? So next slide, thanks. We have our example and our non-example of a measurable and realistic goal here. Oftentimes we'll see things like, oh, we want the student to be 100% accurate or 100% you know, frequency with this particular data. Well, if we're not expecting peers to perform with 100% accuracy, we shouldn't expect that same rate from students with disabilities. So again, it really should be within the realm of sort of possible and realistic performance for the student. Similarly, if we set a goal for 50%, right, we're essentially saying that the behavior will just happen by mere chance alone. And that's problematic. We need to raise expectations, right, for student performance to a rate commensurate with peers. So what we want to see, right, are those realistic and ambitious goals. We want to see it at around 90% for behaviors we want to increase, or 10 to 20% for behaviors we want to decrease. And again, always thinking about sort of that peer performance as the guiding mechanism that we're sort of thinking about here. Once we set those measurable and realistic goals, right, we want to graph them. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time sort of talking about how important this visual depiction of data is. As Teri mentioned, right, so many schools we work with, you know, they understand the importance of data collection. They're collecting those point sheets, those daily behavior ratings, those observations, but, you know, visually graphing the data is absolutely critical to engage in defensible decision making. So you see we have some sample graphs here, right, depicting student performance. And we always want to include that goal line so that we can visualize progress. Again, once we've articulated that in advance, it'll be pretty clear what we need to do, right, if we're meeting that goal consistently or not. And then we can engage in some database problem solving real time as we see those data. So I really encourage folks to be mindful about graphing those data in an ongoing way so that we can actually look at them and interpret them and make decisions based on them. So again, we're going to take all those forms that we have, and we're going to put them utilizing those graphs. And so just with academic progress monitoring, this allows us to see more quickly if we need to adjust instruction or intervention. We don't want to wait for the student to fail. We want to respond to their needs. So how do we start to interpret those graphs? Well, one of the most straightforward ways we can do that is just through visual analysis. And visual analysis of those graphs includes three general parts. We want to look at the level of the data on average, right? Sort of did the behavior improve between baseline and intervention? Trend, right? So looking at the slope of the data, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it staying the same? And then looking at variability, right? So how much the scores are actually fluctuating. And each of those pieces will be informative, right, about sort of what needs to happen next in terms of making decisions. So if we've performed good measurements, if we set good decision rules in advance, and if we graph the data, making decisions based on the data becomes pretty straightforward. We can engage in data-based decision making. So if the student is meeting their goal consistently, at the initial review date, we can consider a couple of different courses of action. We can gradually increase, right, that goal. We can think about fading supports, but continuing to collect data. If the behavior is not making adequate progress towards that goal, we can think about reviewing the data, again, to make some adjustments, adaptations, intensifications to the approach that we're using to intervene. We can think about changing the reinforcer or increasing the schedule of reinforcement. Or we could also revisit those ABC data, right, those antecedent behavior consequence data, to ensure that the intervention is addressing the correct function of the behavior. With that, I will turn it back over to Teri to give us a summary of what to do here.
Thank you, Faith. So we are at the summary stage. We're going to hopefully leave a couple minutes for some questions. So if you have some questions that you've already been thinking about, and I know that there have been some that have come in, feel free to send those in now, and we'll try to save some time to answer them as well. But really, in summary, what we want to think about with our IEP goals is what we're trying to answer through them. So what is the student, what do they need to know or be able to do? That's going to be the focus of our goal and our instruction. And then how will progress toward this annual goal be measured? And that's our data collection and our progress monitoring piece that we've been talking about. Some of the things that we want to caution you around are the pitfalls that we've seen. So as an example, goals not aligning with areas of need identified in those present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So I always like to give this example because it's very close to my heart. It's something that a family member of mine has an IEP, and they have social skills deficits as identified through their present levels at the school that they're attending. But yet their IEP goal is actually focused on whether or not they're going to raise their hand in class. Raising hand behavior is not going to help the social skills deficit that that person has, right? And so we want to make sure that as we're developing goals, they are meaningful to what we are identifying through data as the need. The other thing that we've seen as a common pitfall is that they only address a small part of it, right? So they might have a broader reading comprehension issue, but we're only looking at sight word recognition as the area that we're going to collect information about or write our goal about. We also see that progress is measured either by observational trials or anecdotal notes, and data aren't able to be interpreted easily. Those data in particular aren't able to be interpreted for responsiveness. As Faith was mentioning, we really want to make sure that we can make defensible decisions around whether or not a student is responding. And so the other piece that we want to talk about, and this goes on to the next slide, is how DBR and valid and reliable progress monitoring tools can really help us make an IEP process feasible. So as we are developing that process, as we are thinking about progress monitoring, it can really help us set a measurable goal that is comparable to baseline performance, or comparable, sorry, different words there. They look the same, but setting a measurable goal. So we want to be looking at, is the student actually making progress in comparison to how they performed previously? We're able to collect data frequently, and this is going to help us with that school-home connection, because we're going to be able to share, hey, check this out, your student was at 65% last week, but we increased our intervention a little bit, and now they're up to 70% academically engaged during math instruction. We're going to keep encouraging them. We hope that you do the same at home. And then that can also help us as we're developing out our quarterly progress updates and annual goals. So I will tell you, my scenario that I talked about in the very, very beginning of the webinar as being a school social worker, I always felt like I was scrambling and just trying to pull pieces of information together to put together my quarterly progress report notes for students with IEPs that had social and emotional goal areas that I was addressing through social work services. I was just pulling from, you know, here's this anecdotal note, or I did an observation here, or this piece of information. Had I done more frequent progress monitoring through through direct behavior rating, so through that DBR method, I would have already had those data collected, graphed, and analyzed for responsiveness, making it way more easy for me to put it into a quarterly progress report and or to help with determining the annual goal the next year as we're reviewing it as the IEP team. And it does allow for that flexibility if the needs change over time. So those are some of the key things that we want you to kind of take away and to be thinking about. We're going to open up now for question and answers, and we've already seen some come through. So let's see if we've got some.
Yeah, so Teri, there's one in here and both Teri and Faith, in thinking about kind of the switch and pushing folks to kind of move away from focusing on educator behaviors, for example, number of prompts. What are some ideas that you might have in helping to kind of help with that transition and really helping teams to really shift their focus on educator behaviors to focusing more on those student behaviors you were talking about? Any suggestions there?
I can come up with some. Faith, feel free to jump in if you've got any examples. But I think one of the things that we want to steer folks away from is that focus on educator behaviors, right? Ideally, we want to be able to show that we're teaching something. We can't necessarily, we can provide prompts, but what is it that we're actually teaching the student to do or not to do, right? And that's really the focus of the replacement behavior. And I think that this is one of the things, and Faith kind of mentioned this on one of her slides, is that as we become so focused on trying to decrease a problem behavior, we oftentimes forget that teaching part of where the student really needs to focus on for a social skill or a social and emotional skill that they might be needing to kind of build. So I think that would be kind of my response in a very short way, probably not as eloquent as I could normally say it, but Faith, I don't know if you have anything to add into that.
No, I completely agree. I think that you know, your points are spot on. That's what we need to be. That's what we need to be doing.
And it sounds like it's kind of supporting educators and others in mindset shifts about kind of what is the best way for us to really move this work forward. And some challenging conversations probably need to take place, but it will help us in the long run. Another question that we got around implementation challenges was really thinking about kind of in your experiences, what are some of the most common obstacles that teams really need to overcome as they kind of shift this implementation and look at this implementation? Is it things like team training and lack of administrator support or lack of sufficient personnel? Are there areas that folks really need to focus in on as early wins in implementation that they could really, you know, focus on supporting to move the bar here?
Sure, I'm happy to speak to one thing that comes to mind. I think for me, a big barrier, a big obstacle is folks just not having the systems and structures in place to do this and do it well. I think the situation that Teri described, right, sort of us going around and trying to collect those data sort of at the last minute and putting them into the IEP, Again, we really just need to be a lot more proactive and intentional about it. And in order to do that, right, we need sort of systems and structures in place to support us in that work. And so for me, I think that's one of the biggest obstacles that I see is folks not being thoughtful about setting up those structures and those systems, right? What are those? What's the process for reviewing data? What's the process for graphing those data in a timely fashion, collecting those data, all of that, that really needs to be thought about and figured out in advance.
Great, and I think that kind of goes to one of the questions that I saw in the chat a little bit earlier as well, that was really around kind of, you talked in this webinar really specifically about supporting behavioral IEP goal development, but really in thinking about this data collection process and goal setting and monitoring process, you know, is this relevant? And if so, you know, how might it be relevant for kind of students that are not identified as well? Are there any differences? Are there similarities? What would you think about as you think about kind of that initial tiered system of support in addition to the targeting specifically on IEP goals?
Yeah, I think that's, go ahead, Teri.
I was going to say, I think the process is the same, right? We see many students who are a part of Tier 1, Tier 2 instruction that need some behavioral support and need some work on behavioral skills, but it's not rising to the level of them qualifying for an IEP and or requiring significant accommodations and modifications within the classroom setting. But we could, you know, potentially still follow the same processes around understanding what that student's behavior, how they're demonstrating that behavior and why they might be demonstrating that behavior to help us identify some potential changes to academic instruction or the academic setting for which that behavior is occurring. But, you know, still making sure that we're following the same processes as far as having a goal that we're measuring against. And that could also help us to determine, you know, down the line, if the student does end up qualifying for an IEP, you know, is behavior an area that is likely to impede their learning and or success in school that we need to continue to address through behavioral programming within the IEP.
Yeah, and just one quick add-on. I love this question because I think we're so good at this on the academic side of things, but then when it comes to behavior, right, it can be less so. And so, you know, I think that, you know, to me, yeah, absolutely having those structures and systems in place for Tier 2 type of progress monitoring is really important. And for me, the big differentiator is just intensity of data collection, right? So the type of data collection we're going to be engaging in at Tier 2 versus, you know, more intensive cases is going to vary, right? The intensity, the frequency of that data collection is going to be ramped up, right, for those students who need, you know, additional support. So for me, that's sort of the differentiating factor is that intensity of data collection, sort of matching the level of intensity of support for the student.
Great.
And I was just going to say that I've seen a couple questions that are in there around like reliability and potential validity of DBR, and I do kind of want to give a couple different examples, just why this process is reliable from a practitioner standpoint, right? So Chris Riley-Tillman, who has done a lot of research on the DBR, if you're familiar with his work at all, he is a senior advisor for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and he and I have actually co-presented. He's the reason why we're connected with Faith Miller in the first place, and we thank him for that because she's been a great collaborator. But one of the things that he shared at a conference presentation that I think resonates with folks as you're thinking about this tool and the potential for some reliability around it is this. If you're a new parent and your doctor tells you to monitor your student's or your child's diaper changes, right? So they want you to kind of be looking for things like, you know, are you changing the diaper more frequently? Does the nature and topography of the child's diaper look, smell, all those, there's a consistency different. It's kind of a gross example, but I think it relates really well because if we're thinking about measuring in one specific targeted time period, so let's say math instruction, that teacher or whoever is providing the rating is going to be able to tell you pretty consistently over time. In a sense, they become their own control, that the the student's behavior changed in some way, shape, or form, or yes, it did actually decrease over time. And that's similar to what that doctor was recommending for a parent of a newborn, is to make sure that you're looking for those different features. They may not be asking you to collect a frequency chart on how many times you are actually changing a diaper, but generally speaking, parents of newborns can tell you, yes, I changed way more diapers today than I did yesterday. I was chatting with Faith a little bit before this webinar, and I made a joke. I'm like, we could probably do a comparison with the coronavirus right now and hand washing frequency. I guarantee that many of you could say with certainty that your hand washing frequency probably went up as a result of the coronavirus and all of the different news out there related to that. And so you could measure over time whether or not you stay consistent with it, whether or not, you know, you're actually, did I actually wash for 20 seconds and 10-second rinse, or whatever it is that the recommendations are. So be thinking about that. Your teacher becomes their own control. You become your own control as you're thinking about the ratings that you're providing on DBR. And that's one of the reasons why they're able to find reliability information on the tool. I know it's 1 o'clock, so I want to go ahead and wrap us up.
Yeah, and Teri, I just wanted to mention one thing real quickly. We saw a number of questions in there about accessing the recording and whether that will be sent out to you. A link to where the recording will be, I posted it in the chat a couple times as well. It will be up on the NCII website, so we will have to post the recording up there. It usually takes us about a day or two. We will hopefully try and get it as quickly as we can up and available for you. But that link will be included in the thank you email that you receive at the end of this webinar, as well as a link to an evaluation. So we'd love your feedback on that. We know there was a lot of questions that we didn't get to dig into as much as well. So feel free to keep reaching out to the center, asking us for additional information and supports, and we'll try our best to answer those as much as possible that we can. So yeah, definitely keep connecting with us. We know we were only able to touch the surface with this. It's really a big topic, and we really are appreciative of both Teri and Faith's perspectives and great learning and starting of the conversation, but we know that we didn't finish it here. So feel free to continue to connect with us and take a look at that guide if you haven't done so already. There's a lot of great content and context in there as well that might be something for you to share with others and your colleagues to really have this conversation, especially as you're starting to shift, you know, mindsets around the data you collect, or, you know, some of those implementation barriers you talked about earlier as well. So the website is up there for you. You can see it, intensiveintervention.org. That will be where you can find the information for this webinar. It will be up on the homepage in that scroll bar where you could see it earlier when you might have registered there. It will be a number of different places in the search and all of that. If you have any problems finding it, you can email us at ncii@air.org, and we will make sure you get that recording. And then in the rest of the slide deck, there are just some additional resources that might help you both on the academic goal setting side. There was a webinar a couple weeks ago on that, and a guide that came out around that as well as other information on intensive intervention and DBI. So thank you so much for taking the time today. Thank you both, Faith and Teri, for your wonderful content, and we really appreciate all of you joining on a busy Friday, and hope this information was helpful for you. So thank you again. Don't hesitate to reach out to us, connect to us on social media, or check out our YouTube channel where this will also be posted as well. All right. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.